Hello, welcome to our next unit. We're going to start in these sets of videos to talk about biological psychology. And this is a really important sort of foundational subject here, as similarly to how methods is really important to understand how we study psychology, biological psychology and how our biology fits into how we think and feel and behave and perceive is really important to understand a lot of the things going forward, like how we sense and perceive the world, how we develop throughout our lifetimes, how we think, how we interpret scenarios and understand ourselves and other people. So this is going to, you know, be a little bit on the maybe more scientific side of the class, even though psychology is all science. But this will seem very familiar to classes like biology that you might have taken before or in high school. But I also try not to make it too technical and make it really clear how the stuff that we're going to talk about connects to psychology. So as we go through biological psychology, we're going to cover a few different sort of subtopics. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about neurons and neurotransmitters. We'll talk about how neurons are basically the main source of communication for your body to coordinate movement and sense things in the world. Um, Kind of a step up in complexity, we'll talk about the brain and the nervous system, which is made up of neurons and communicates via neurotransmitters. Then we'll talk about a different sort of communication system your body has, the endocrine system, that uses hormones and glands rather than neurons and helps with some different but related processes. We'll also talk a little bit, kind of at the same time, about genetics and evolution and how different suites of human behaviors and other types of traits that you have been selected for and are communicated in yet another way through genes. And we'll talk about the ways that psychologists might study these as well. We also should be making sure, I'm making it clear why we're talking about this here. Because I think a lot of people get to this chapter and they think like, oh, we got to review biology to talk about psych. But again, it's really hard to understand a lot of things about psychology and the processes involved if we don't understand the underlying biology. And more recently, especially as different techniques like computer imaging and computer simulations become more sophisticated, we are really kind of looking back into biology to think about how we can understand our behavior and how we think. So, a famous cognitive neuroscience, Endel Tolving, he has this quote that I think is very telling about this connection. As a scientist, I am compelled to the conclusion that there must exist certain physical chemical changes in the nervous tissue that correspond to all psychological processes. The alternative stance, that it may be possible for any behavior or any thought to occur independently of physical changes in the nervous system, is sheer mysticism. So this is a pretty hard line, but I think reasonable stance to say that anything that we're going to talk about in this class, anything that you perceive, anything that you think or feel, or any reasons for your behavior, all of those things have some sort of biological basis. So none of them are happening, in some sort of ethereal, out of body or disconnected from your physical structures sense. Everything that's going on, the way that I am speaking and deciding what words to use, the way that I'm interpreting the world around me, all of that has to do with physical changes in your body, in your cells, in your neurons. So the way that this communication happens then is through your nervous system for the most part. And you might think about breaking this down into some different steps. One way to look at it might be you're receiving input from the world all the time. The sound waves that I'm hearing from people talking to me, the light that is hitting my eye that I'm using to interpret visually what's going on, the way that I am feeling the temperature in this room or the wind out when I'm outside. All of those things are input that I'm getting from the world. And we'll talk more about this stuff when we get into sensation and perception in the next chapter too. So there's all of this input that my nerves, my neurons are sending to my brain. My brain interprets all of those things and makes them into usable information. And then I am more or less consciously, depending on what the process is, I am using that information generally to decide what movements to make, where to look, if I'm supposed to run or walk, if I'm trying to speak or use some sort of nonverbal communication. All this stuff breaks down to how your nervous system is communicating these inputs, processing them, and engaging in outputs. Now, obviously, that's a very complex process, and it's usually not as simple as input, process, output. All these things are happening simultaneously in several different processes. Like, I'm not thinking separately about what the wall looks like and separately about where I should be looking and how I'm holding my hands, right? A lot of this stuff is happening at the same time and might often be somewhat outside of awareness. But to understand this a little bit better, I like to break down the biological side of psychology into some specific questions that we might think about as adaptive problems. So, how did our biological structures arise to solve the types of problems that we have to survive as human beings? So, how does the human body accomplish this communication? Particularly with the nervous system, how are we handling this input and output? What is the communication process? Is it, telegraphs? Is it some sort of electrical signal? Well, no, it's something a little bit more complex than that. How does your brain, once it has that information, initiate and coordinate behavior? Movement primarily would be what we're talking about there, but other types of output as well, like speaking, all sorts of different things, looking where you need to look. How does the body regulate growth and other functions that might not have as much to do with nerves and like movement? So the more automatic processes that might be going on in our body, like digestion or secreting the correct hormones at the right time. And then finally, how do we adapt as a species? Like any other species, we have adaptive pressures on us that lead us to be more successful if we have particular genetic traits and behaviors. So how does this code work, and how does that interact with things we experience in our environment? So I hope as we go through the rest of these videos for this unit, you'll see how we at least try to answer some of these questions. In an intro class like this, we're not going to have incredibly complex answers to all of these, but we will at least touch on all of these questions. So first, the question about communication within your body. Perhaps the primary way that our body is communicating is through what I've already mentioned, the nervous system. And this is this combination of organs and mostly cells inside of your body. So you have the central nervous system, which is referred to as the brain and the spinal cord, this bundle of nerves and nerve fibers and neurons running partway down your body, connecting to your brain. Kind of the superhighway within your body where a lot of information is being processed and sent. So those are the organs involved. Then we have lots of cells separately that are making up this peripheral nervous system. All the other neurons and nerves spreading out through our body. And as you might expect, neurons in your body are incredibly numerous. Your brain is made up of, bundles and curls of neurons, and there are at least 100 billion neurons just in your brain, and many, many more spread throughout your body into nerve fibers. So these are the things that are allowing communication. You're feeling things with your fingers. That information is sent up through your arm into your spinal cord and finally into your brain where it is processed in some way. And then if you want to engage in some kind of motion like chewing, your brain sends a signal to the proper muscles, which contract or extend time to engage in that process, or sending that signal further, perhaps down to your leg or foot to move to walk. So a lot of this stuff is kind of automatic, right? And we'll talk about the different parts of the nervous system that engage in more deliberative or more automatic types of behavior. There are also sort of passive parts of your nervous system, if you will. There are perhaps somewhere between 10 and 50 times as many cells that are supporting the neurons and the rest of the nervous system that are still really, part of the nervous system, kind of the infrastructure, the scaffolding of your nervous system. And these cells are called glial cells. They are supporting the neurons in some way. In many cases, as we'll talk about, they are insulating, kind of keeping them in place, but insulating them to help them be able to send their signal, basically, through a process we'll get to, I think, on the next slide, called myelination, which just, again, wraps the neuron and allows it to send itself more quickly and efficiently. Finally, we have, rather than just single neurons, they're bundled up in certain places, particularly the spinal cord, into nerves. And you have nerves that go throughout your body as well. Your sciatic nerve running down your leg, and these bundles are really tightly wound, kind of ropes of neurons that are allowing that information to flow. So, what does a neuron actually look like, and what is it composed of? So again, neurons, like any other cells, have some different parts. They have a body and a nucleus. For a neuron, its body is kind of the bigger part that includes the nucleus here, but there's also this really interesting that comes off on the side and kind of is where the information is sent down, basically. And I'll break down all these different parts in the next few slides too. But the neuron has these tree-like structures called dendrites that are coming off. These are the structures that are receiving information. The nucleus gets that information, basically, and if there's proper stimulation in some combination from the dendrites, then it is going to send a signal down what's called the axon, this kind of arm-like structure that goes off generally in one direction. And this is where that myelin comes in, that support structure that's insulating the axon to make the spread of information more efficient. Then, at the end of the axon, you have these things called axon terminals, or terminal buttons. This is where the neuron communicates to the next neuron. So these axons, presumably, are connected to dendrites on the next neurons. These things are connected in rows, basically, but extremely complex webs of neurons. It's kind of hard to even conceptualize how many connections they have, honestly. This is a false color image of what something closer to what neurons actually look like inside your body. So you can see how complex these connections might be. The cell bodies here, dendrites here, and axons going on, or the axon rather, going off in one direction with the terminal buttons. But even this doesn't do it justice, because a single neuron within your brain, for example, can have up to 10,000 connections with other neurons. So these are all incredibly complex in how they're connected to one another, and how far and wide that communication might spread, and the different networks within your brain that might include the same or different types of neurons. So it's a very complex structure that, honestly, again, is just kind of hard to wrap your mind around sometimes. So again, I've talked about this stuff already, but I want to give you a slide that has like a more specific list here. Cell body, I've mentioned, has the nucleus inside of it, like any cell has a nucleus. You might also hear the cell body referred to as the soma. The dendrites, again, are these tree-like structures. They're branching out from the body, and they're getting input from the axons of other neurons. So you might have, 5 to 10,000 different axon terminals that are going into this dendrite. Then you have the long fiber coming off this axon, and that's where the message is sent. The dendrites get the information and then send the message down the axon to the next neurons through the axon terminals into further down dendrites. So these axon terminals or terminal buttons, again, these are these little swellings at the end that we'll see some closer up views of those. That's where neurotransmitters are released, little chemicals that are going to go to the next dendrites and stimulate those dendrites in an electrochemical sort of manner. Um, the myelin sheath, just again to repeat this, these glial cells, these sort of structural cells that are covering the axon, again, they speed up transmission, they insulate it so that transmission can be more efficient. Not all neurons are myelinated, though. Not all neurons have this myelin sheath. So ones that are more perhaps important or central to the communication within your body are going to be the ones that have myelin. Because if you think about it, we have to be efficient in how our bodies are constructed, and not all neurons are equal, basically. Some of them are more important or more often used, and those are going to be the ones that you're going to spend that myelin on, basically, and use up those cells. So your body's kind of choosy in how it's going to use these limited resources. Okay, in the next video, I'll start talking about different types of neurons and then talk a little bit more specifically about how the messages are sent within and between them.